Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants. Welcome to this special session on financing opportunities for urban development projects. It's a very pertinent topic, and I'm sure since we all must know of projects that could use some funding, it will be very useful for everybody. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Paul Martin. I am the Senior Technical Advisor for UNCDF and the IMIF Regional Manager for ASEAN and Pacific. I'd just like to make a couple of pieces of information available regarding house rules and interpretation. The first one, we'll use the Chatham House rules. So please, if you've got questions to ask, put them into the comments box. And secondly, this session is also available in all languages in Southeast Asia. Access can be found next to, on the tabs called interpretation, next to the chat boxes. And please, when you access in a second language, make sure that you mute the floor language, as you will hear both recordings or both languages being interpreted at the same time. So today we're going to talk about financing opportunities. And I would like to start our session by noting that our has found that over 40% of the priority sub-areas under sustainable urbanization face major barriers to access alternative financing, making funding and financial critical issues for most projects. I would also like to just raise that it's also about affordable financing. So this special session will focus on how to identify potential financial opportunities for urban development. We will do this by first discussing the financial barriers that cities often face in access to affordable finance, and then by discussing opportunities for cities to get exposure to alternative sources of financing and improve their abilities to secure capital. The agenda for this session will be as follows. We'll start with a presentation on the SDG City and Financing Sustainable Urban Development. We will then hear a presentation on planning, prioritization and procurement, implementation support to Southeast Asian governments and ASEAN. Following this, we'll have a panel discussion on how city representatives can plan for and apply for alternative funding opportunities. And we'll wrap up with questions from the audience, followed by a short summary and conclusion. I'd like now to take the opportunity to introduce our speakers and panelists today. It's a very distinguished group of people with a lot of expertise and experience within the financing field. Joining us today to present are Mr. David Aubrey, the Interregional Advisor for UN Habitat, and Ms. Lynn Toll, Project Finance and Infrastructure Advisor for P4I and Ernst & Young. For the panel discussion, we will be also joined by Natalie Su Wen Oh, Strategy and Policy Analysis of Think City, and Ms. Fazouza Zen, the Senior Economist of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN Area and East Asia. So I'd like to really hand over now to the city representative, and we'll start the session with a presentation on SDG Cities and Financing Sustainable Urban Development from David Aubrey. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the ASEAN Sustainable Urban Development Forum for inviting me to join you. So maybe we can have the slides up if you don't mind. Thank you. So basically, we in the discussion of the trying to finance sustainable development, I'll talk firstly of the SDG Cities program as a sort of background to what we're trying to do. So we go to the next slide. What we see globally is that on one hand, the financing gap for sustainable urban development is in its trillions. On the other hand, there's a lot of money out there. We see a real trend of these major finances towards wanting to invest in SDGs and wanting to have an impact. And there is finance out there, but the challenge often seems to be how do you sort of channel finance to cities and to urban projects? And I think there are two sort of major bottlenecks. One is that cities are often not seen as viable partners for investment. Maybe they need to have improved financial management systems or improved revenue, more accountable systems of governance, etc. But also the projects are frequently not designed and structured in a way that makes them feasible for finance. And there's a huge gap, particularly in the developing countries that we're working on, in that project preparation stage of being able to develop and present projects for finance. But let me just sort of go back a bit onto the next slide. What we're trying to do with SDG cities is what we realize is that cities can be massive agents for achieving the SDGs. More than half of the world's population live in cities, and cities have a massive impact on the territories around them. And 2/3 of the SDGs are relevant to cities. So what we're trying to do is to link city data with strategic planning, then with the identification of projects, and then with the project financing. And we're trying to create a movement called SDG Cities that brings together the private sector, that brings together city networks, that brings together national governments and systems, national systems of cities. And we have the ambition to reach 1,000 cities and impact on 1 billion lives. And in the parallel track to the data, to planning, to project development and finance, we're also trying to build those capacities of local authorities around inclusive governance, planning, finance, and service delivery. These are areas identified in the new urban agendas as being critical capacities needed by cities. And to do this, we have digitized tools in all these areas. So with data, we have the urban monitoring framework, the global urban monitoring framework agreed across the UN system. We're digitizing that now so cities can enter their data and understand their baseline and their challenges. Strategic planning, we have guidelines around that. When it comes to building capacity, we have diagnostic tools on revenue, diagnostic tools on planning, on governance. So all of these are digital. Cities can enter the data and have clear recommendations of their gaps. Then cities can connect with each other, the ones with similar learning profiles, and be trained in groups of cities and groups of institutions. So it's really all about methodologies using digitization to reach as many cities as possible and to group cities together in a learning profile. If we go to the next slide, and we might just skip this slide and go to the next one. Next one. So yeah, as I was mentioned, there's a data track, there's action planning, there's the enablement, which is about building capacity, and then investment. If we go to the next slide. So since the conversation here is mainly about investment, I wanted to introduce the City Investment Facility, and I noticed that Natalie from Think City is also on the call. This is a facility that's been put together by a group of partners, and it has a sort of process flow that you have a kind of projects through the city, through the SDG Cities program. There'll be a pipeline of projects coming through, and we can also do open calls for projects. These projects arrive in the City Investment Portal, which has been kindly put together by our partner Think City. And here projects can be showcased on the portal, and it allows city officials to reach out to a global audience of investors, and these investors can see what projects are there on the pipeline. So they can start interacting straight away with these cities. most of the projects on the pipeline, I think there are more than 50 of them at the moment, they're not quite ready for investment yet. So the City Investment Advisory Platform then does a bit of a deep dive and provides that sort of advisory service in the upstream project preparation, bankability and SDG impact. So our projects need to be clearly delivering on SDGs. They're assessed against the SDGs, but they need to be structured in a way that can be financed. And this takes quite a lot of advisory. So currently we're building what's called a Feasibility Fund, which is a fund that's being created to enable projects in the Global South to access that advice needed to make those projects able to be invested in. And then finally, we have the vehicles. And sometimes this is where a real extra bit of help is needed to get these projects over line. So we have 3 vehicles at the moment. What they tend to do is to invest. They put the initial sort of first loss investment into the projects. So this is to do due diligence, is to make sure that contractual arrangements are all in place, that everything is set. And then from that, then they can crowd in several sources of finance. And then they cover that early investment by various deal fees that they make with other investors. And when we talk about investors, they're not all commercial investors, they're not all private investors. You know, there's philanthropic, there's public sources, there's development banks, and the rest of it. So, and they then work on what is the ideal composition of investment to make this happen. I'm probably running out of time, so let me quickly go, and do tell me to stop if I'm going over time. Next slide. So at the moment, we have projects in a number of different sectors, as you can see there. And a lot of these projects are actually very relevant for COVID. And in terms of distribution, at least a quarter of the projects coming in are from Asia and Pacific. Next slide. So currently we have 55 projects in the portal. I think that the total value is over 5 billion at the moment. And it does take time to get through. So we have 6 of the projects came through the World Urban Forum, and so there are various projects currently within the CIAP, the advisory platform, and out of the 55 projects that have come through, 3 of them now are close to reaching financial conclusion. So I think key challenges in moving forward, and what the nut that we really have to crack, is how to bring investment into very small cities and even into communities. When we look at the next 30 years, we'll see globally that 2.5 billion people will be added to the urban population. And it's absolutely key that this population growth is absorbed in small and secondary cities, not in the massive cities. If it's absorbed in the small cities, then that will have massive economic impacts. It'll have positive economic impacts. It will make countries more resilient. It will strengthen urban-rural dynamics and economies. So the challenge, and something we're working towards between now and World Urban Forum, is really a deep dive on how we can attract that finance to small cities. Currently, big cities are able to attract finance, small cities are struggling. So there's work to be done. But I think I'll leave you there, and perhaps we can pick up on some of this thing in a discussion. Back to you. Thank you.
So thank you, David. That's a very, very interesting presentation. And it really illustrates how the facilities bring in innovation to city finance and the development of city projects, and the use of digital solutions to help that process. And we certainly would like to hear a lot more from Aubrey. So if you do have any questions specifically, could you put those in the comments box, and we'll get back to answering those. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to now move on to the next presentation, which is about structuring, and it was mentioned by Aubrey as being one of the critical areas of work. So we received a presentation about structuring bankable urban infrastructure projects that are attractive for investments. We welcome Ms. Lin Tu to the virtual floor to present this presentation. Thank you, Lin.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to speak. And thanks, Aubrey, for a great presentation as well, which hits on a lot of similar topics. And it's a great follow-on for what we're about to share in terms of financing and developing bankable projects. If we can maybe go to the first slide. Thank you. So just to echo what Aubrey has said and what Paul has also mentioned, it's very clear that the speed of urbanization and also the growing expectations from the public in terms of public services and infrastructure has increased. The other element we've also seen hugely impacting decisions by governments is also that new technologies are bringing a disruption into how we used to do things. So how we work, how we travel, even how we communicate. I think all of you have experienced the WhatsApp being down for about 6 hours and the implications to work. And therefore, governments need to consider what sort of investments is really needed to underpin the type of growth that we envisage, and also in what sectors to modernize the infrastructure to meet some of the demands. And I think Aubrey made a very important point as well. The funding and development of cities have been focused on I guess, your capital cities. And therefore now with changing demographics and also urbanization congestion, we're really looking at how to support the secondary cities in developing their infrastructure needs as well. And that will ultimately benefit sort of the greater public and also in a way even out the economic growth in different countries. So if we move on to the next stage. So as countries prioritize and assess the needs, it's very clear that we see from our studies that majority of municipalities, especially in the second tier bracket or the smaller ones, fall short in terms of their ability to fund projects on their own. So if you look at your traditional financing sources like your treasury funding, where you borrow, and then your government funding like taxes, grants as well, and even multilateral funding, there is quite a significant gap if you measure actually what are the funding requirements to match your infrastructure needs. And over the last decade, what we've seen is that infrastructure, from an investor point of view, has been growing rapidly. So over the last decade, infrastructure has become an investment category. And you can see from the right side of the box, there is now a range of private finance that's available, to fund and interested in funding projects. And the market appetite is definitely there. The issue is we've also known, I think you've heard that the amount of money is available, but how it goes into infrastructure has been quite slow. And there are a number of reasons for that. Infrastructure, whilst I think in 2019 and the rolling average of over the last 5 years, I think there's been 100 billion gone into infrastructure. This still falls far short of the trillions that is needed. And therefore, one of the conditions is that how do we actually access all this and understand what the criteria are for getting private sector funding into infrastructure development. It's very clear also, one of the things we do always say is that the majority of funding of infrastructure is still by the public sector in terms of the accountability. It's just how we best bring the private sector participation in, either through funding or through expertise into the development of sustainable infrastructure. So if you look at the range, I can go through them, but I think we'll be short of time, but happy to take questions offline. If we go to the next slide. So when we work with governments, the first thing sometimes we talk about is, there's so much money, why isn't it coming in, and what are the challenges? Because whilst there's a lot of money, there's also competition for the funding, and money, and the investors will look at the more robust projects, what suits their risk appetite, what sort of returns in making decisions to invest in infrastructure. So you would have heard from many presentations that you need well-prepared, well-structured projects with adequate risk allocation, and you need to compete them. But what does this all mean? So hopefully, I know it's a very short period of time, but I've tried to break it down into what some of the considerations are for investors and so also public sector to how to bring a project to a bankable state. So you typically start with what we call the project preparation, which is the business plan, and then truly understanding the risk allocation between the private sector role and also what the public sector role is. And this process is important because it starts to address, and that's also your costs, looks at what your funding gap is, what your needs are, and also drives then the understanding of the issues. So what we found is, typically the challenges are there's the business plan or the project preparation hasn't been done well. The understanding of actually the funding requirements and also the financing issues need to be improved. The investors also look at institutional structures and institutional capacity, because if an investor is going to enter into a long-term contract or financing arrangement, they will look at who they're dealing with, the government agencies, are their private sector rights protected, and things like that. And also very important is, as I think we'll talk about hopefully in the questions, is development of the domestic capital and financial markets. That's going to be critical to also unlocking funding from local sources, which also helps the economy rather than always depending on international funding. So some of these challenges are quite common, and I guess the next slide is how do we address some of these challenges. So really, understanding the business plan, understanding the funding gap, understanding the role of the private sector, also understanding where the project generates value. How a project generates value from a governmental and country perspective is very different to how an investor will look at the cash flows of a project. Because a project which may not be standalone financeable but could generate multiple economic benefits to a country. So we need to set, in a way, the context of the project and what is suitable. And then once you understand that, you look at what is the appropriate funding and finance options. And from the slide before, if you look at, say you have public funding, which we understand, and you have a range of private finance. So, you need to understand construction risk in terms of what funders are comfortable with construction risk. There is now the development of municipal bonds at the city's level, but that would require, let's say, a certain regulation and credit rating. We could also look at blended finance. And the other area that's becoming increasingly looked at is monetization, and that's monetization of your existing assets, their all value, how you actually create a funding program which might help fund new developments as well. Then the other area, after looking at the different funding options, is how do we procure and engage with the private sector? What is it sensible to transfer risk over? Do you transfer all risks? Do you share the risk? And from an investor point of view is, what are the identifiable returns from the project as well? And what are the risks associated with that? So there's a range of procurement strategies from a city's point of view. You can do a direct delivery, you can do PPPs, you can do operating contracts. So you really need to understand what the value is of the private sector participation and funding brings, and which makes it affordable. And the final overarching one is sort of ensuring that there's a legal and regulatory framework that is an enabling environment to bring the private sector participation in. From a private sector point of view, if you're making a decision to invest over a 10, 20, 30-year period, having the legal protections and understanding the implications of how you operate, taxes, contract breakage is all very important. And these are considerations because they will be waiting, investing over a long time, like the pension funds. And finally, also, when we deal with governments, is development of institutional capacity within the government. I worked in a number of governments, and governments are good administrators, managing contracts and setting up a sort of a contract team and a PMO team. These are on, and what to do and how to engage with private sector also ensures that we get the full benefit of the private sector participation. And my last slide, I appreciate I'm running out of time, it's really, I'm a representative of P4I and a partner in Ernst & Young. So P4I is really a team of 5 organizations led from and supported by the Australian government. Clearly, Australia has a very successful and broad infrastructure program. And through the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, P4I we work with DFAT, the Asia Foundation, and Anna Smith and Ninty One to work with our partner governments in Southeast Asia to really help deliver that growth that we talked about in a sustainable and in high quality manner in how we develop infrastructure. So the areas we focus on are really the areas we've identified as critical, which is areas of policy and regulation, prioritization and planning, and also procurement. So to give an example, how do you develop a business case? If you do, let's say, if you're developing a road, how would you develop a business case for the road, develop the forecasts that would meet private sector expectations, and then how do you determine what the funding gap is in terms of the planning as well, and the project preparation. So how do you do a good feasibility study or pre-feasibility, what you should focus on, and also what are the enabling regulations? I think there's always talk about PPP legislation as an example, but in some areas, while there's PPP legislation, how does the PPP legislation work along with existing legislation so that the investors and the government is also clear on how a project takes through its life cycle. The key areas that we focus on is transport, energy, utility, digital, and also some cross-border work. And in that sense, we provide sort of direct advisory services. We also look at G2G partnerships. Are there learnings we can learn at the government level, and also knowledge sharing based on experience on projects and also networking. So in that sense, we hope we can play a role in progressing the development of good quality infrastructure. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand back to Paul.
Okay, thank you, Lynn, and thank you for a very, very informative presentation with some very, very critical elements brought to the front. In particular, thank you for identifying the challenges facing financing of urban projects. And I'm particularly will be very interested in the panel discussions to listen to people's uptake of developing the financial markets, the domestic financial markets, as part of the process. And also, it was very interesting to see that assets can be used to support financing of city projects. And I think this is a very good area of work which can be taken up within the region based upon work which is actually being done by UNDESA at the moment. There's some very interesting work around about municipal assets. So I'd just like now to take the opportunity to move on to the panel discussion. And during this discussion, it would be great if participants to the event and people listening to the discussions provide some comments and questions. Please use the comment file for that. And so now I'd just like to welcome our panelists to answer a round of questions on how funding proposals are evaluated, how sector-specific opportunities present themselves, what other funding sources are out there in the markets, and what value there is in developing long-term funding proposals. So welcome, panelists. And I would just like to, and the panelists are Mr. David Albury, Ms. Lynn Toll, Ms. Farouz Zen, and Ms. Natalie Su Wen. So welcome all on board for this interesting discussion. And you'll have about 4 minutes to answer each of the questions which are raised. And for Ms. Natalie Su Wen, I would like to just ask this or propose this question to you. How can ASEAN cities be connected to a national and global audience of investors? Over to you,
Thank
Natalie.
you, Paul. Thanks. I believe I have a few slides. If magic person behind the technical screen would be able to flash them for me. Right. Great. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'll just do a very quick run by of the opportunities that ASEAN cities have in terms of connecting with investors, both on a global and local level. Next, please. So these are common points that I think Lynn and David have already touched on very well. It's the idea of this urban finance gap that's growing, and whilst there's plenty of demand and investment available, evident through the oversubscription of sustainability bonds in Indonesia and Philippines. And I think that oversubscription is also kind of reflective of that lack of supply. And I think, as Lynn mentioned, that lack of supply comes from the lack of capacity to really develop bankable, investable projects as we move towards different and alternative modes of financing. And I think, again, as Lynn mentioned, the underpinning factor of that is sort of the poor project preparation process, the lack of, again, that capacity and experience to address private sector needs, having that right supportive regulatory environment, and managing risk in the right way. Next, please. So the opportunity here is the city's investment facility, which Lyford has mentioned and sort of touched on already. So I think City is working with UN Habitat and other partners to develop the facility, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative to close the gap in urban finance by helping projects move from that ideation, design, feasibility to financing. So it's really going across the whole project preparation process. Now, the projects that are submitted to the city's investment facility do undergo a degree of rigorous assessment and evaluation in order to give that stamp of approval and assure investors that these projects are de-risked and bankable and have gone through a degree of due diligence. And on the project side of it, they receive the support needed to identify the gaps in capacity and where those gaps can be plugged. So, next please. The city's investment portal is that first entryway into the city's investment facility. It is a digital platform that pulls together all the projects into a single place, creating a pipeline of de-risked investable projects. So this encourages transparency.
Hello, Natalie. Are you still online? We seem to have lost you. Okay, we appear to have a connection problem with Natalie. Hopefully, she can rejoin in the next few minutes, and we can come back at the end of the panel session. I'd like to now to move on to the next question to Ms. Fawuza Zen. And I hope I got the name pronounced right. I most probably haven't, so apologies for that. So basically, the question we'd like to propose to you is, how are some of the main modalities for financing adopted in Southeast Asia? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities associated with such modalities? And we understand there's a lot of regulatory issues also, and issues of harmonization. And it would be very interesting, actually, from an ASEAN perspective, also to hear about the issues of harmonization in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. I hope you can clearly hear me. It's okay. Okay. Thank you for previous speakers. It was a very interesting presentations, and I think what I would like to talk is already mentioned by previous speakers, and over the last years or recent years in Southeast Asia, we observe there's no new breakthrough in financing modalities for especially for urban infrastructure. So yes, the dominant modalities are still traditional approach such as taxes, use of fees, and government bonds, which actually taxes. But for some cities, especially with whose project ownerships with co-ownership with central government, they implemented PPP at the various stages from concession to the full PPP. But only few innovative or new schemes applied in Southeast Asia, for example, land value capture and green bonds or green financings. Yeah, for land value captures, I could not find other cities except Singapore countries. Yeah, it's Singapore's in Southeast Asia that implement these schemes. Yeah, other projects located in Asia but not in Southeast Asia, such as Tokyo and Hong Kong. And for the green financing, Malaysia, I think, is quite progressive. Yeah, there is a government initiatives called Green Technology Financing Scheme. Yeah, that get that facilitate uh, many banks and financial institutions to funding hundreds green initiative projects, yeah, before pandemics. Yeah. And in 2020, I think Vietnam received its first green loan, yeah, from ADB for the development of larger solar plant in Southeast Asia worth around 186 million USD. So, but the challenge is in the modalities. I think Ms. Linto already explained quite well. Yeah, before that, there's a problem, as you also mentioned, in regulatory, etc. But regulations is quite tricky aspect if we talk about that. First, that if government, with the help of supported from the international organization can develop a legal framework for PPP, but implementation is another question, another domain. And yeah, so challenges in these modalities, we can see that in private sources, in tapping the private sources, typically the government in Southeast Asia are still struggling in making a good pipeline. So they have a list of shopping list instead of the prioritized projects, and also risk allocation that already again mentioned by previous speaker, and the capacity of public sector as a leading partner. Yeah, because they need to lead the process, they need to ensure the process works smoothly, and building confidence of the private sectors to join to participate in the project. And for the financing modalities using public sources, first that we could see that almost no city's budget can fulfill the increasing demand for infrastructure. I don't know about Singapore because they have a very high uh, local budget per citizen and per capita, but not in the case of other cities in Southeast Asia. And second, that prioritize, even with the limited budget, yeah, the local government usually still uh, face difficulties in prioritizing these budgets. And again, and the last one is that citizen participation in all states, from planning to executing and monitoring, is still very limited, which is creating the problem of transparency, accountability, etc. I think I stop here for the questions. I get back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fazua. Very interesting comments and a very good explanation of what's happening in the ASEAN region. Green financing appears to be becoming very strong in Vietnam and Malaysia, and that will hopefully spread across the region. It may be also useful to note that, by sharing experiences across the region, maybe we can accelerate the different types of modalities being used by just learning which is being done at best practice levels in various countries. I'll just now like to move on to Mr. Dyfed Albury with a very interesting question, which it could take 2 or 3 days to answer, I'm sure, but unfortunately only have 4 minutes. And the question will be, is how are funding proposals evaluated? What are some of the common evaluation criteria that is being used? And what can city representatives do to develop successful funding proposals? I know it's a long stretch, so if you could have a good go at that. Thank you, Aubrey.
It's muted.
You're mute, Aubrey.
Yeah, we evaluate initially based on how they're performing against SDGs. So UN Habitat has developed over the recent years SDG project SDG project assessment tool, which is something that you can find online. And it looks primarily at principles of the SDGs. So at the moment we don't have, and I think we need to move towards SDG standards for urban projects. And I think this is something that we'd love to be working on the next few years. But at this point, we're looking more around the principles, leaving no one behind, looking at environmental social safeguarding. We're looking at how the project's generating employment, and lots of different criteria across that. So you can find that if you just Google the SDG project assessment tool with UN Habitat. Beyond that, then there's the whole financial side of it, which probably other colleagues might be better to elaborate on what we're looking for in terms of financial preparation. But essentially, investors need to see that the project is de-risked, that the collaterals are in place, that the land, the procurement system, the legislation, and a whole bunch of other things, which I think Lynn would be much better able to talk about than me. But one thing we're starting to work with also is how to reduce the cost of that preparation, and we're starting to work with people like the Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation Source that have developed these online templates to be able to look through all that sort of rigorous criteria. But from our side, it's they need to get through the filter of SDG performance before we even start looking at the financing. Over.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. I'd like to take the opportunity just to ask you an extended question, if I may. It's a very interesting how you evaluate against SDG standards, but how do you reconcile against what you're seeing from the investors and what they're looking for in terms of projects? Over.
Well, we're finding at the moment that there's quite an interest in this idea of impact investing, and so investors do want to see that projects are delivering on key principles. It seems that there's been a lot of work that's been done on the environmental social governance, and this is quite well mainstreamed now in the financial sector. But increasingly, they're looking for SDG impacts. And I think the more we can provide data on that in terms of how projects are contributing to quality of life, which are the SDG indicators that they're working towards, the better that investors are interested. So the more specific we can be, and this is why we need to move towards investment standards, so that there's almost like a blue flag and asset class that is created around SDG projects. But definitely impact investors are looking for clear metrics on SDG impact.
And, okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for that. I would just like then to move on to another question, and I'd like to ask Ms. Lynn Toll to try to provide an answer, because it was a very much a component of your presentation, Lynn. And the question will be, what do you think the main areas of capacity building should be that would help local governments to access financing opportunities?
It's a great question. I think that's also a question that could take a few days, but I'll try and do it in a few minutes. I think the capacity building stems from the fact that the government, when they bring in private sector participation, will have a role on the other side as you procure. So unlike a full privatization when the government goes hands off, typically in PPPs you have a continuing accountability for the delivery of the infrastructure services. So understanding, I would say, project management, large project management through the different project cycles is important, and the implications. Understanding, I guess, contract management in its pure sense is important. The other area also is understanding also that, and I think that one thing that Fauzia mentioned very well is that investors' requirements in terms of, investors will look at project cash flows, the certainty, and therefore projects that will finally go to conclusion will require bankable considerations, which means that the public sector will also need to understand some of the financial risks and risk allocation aspects of projects in terms of understanding who accepts the risks, who is the best placed to accept the risk. So I would say it's understanding risk allocation, contract management, and also project management and project delivery expertise. The other area which is also important is sort of the whole of government. When you look at a project, it's just not the procuring authority. Typically, it does involve multiple agencies, like you've mentioned. It involves land, it involves delivery of services, it involves the Ministry of Finance. So the capacity building needs to cut across a number of agencies in order for a project to be, taken to its full conception. Even in the operations phase, when we've dealt with certain agencies, a lot of them are very, very good at building, and because this is what the government does. But translating that, let's say, to an operation output requirement, where private sector is managing the operation side, it is also a slight change in how governments work, because typically governments operate their own assets. Now you're handing it over potentially to the private sector to operate. So, how would you build the capacity in understanding how to engage with them and what the role of government is? So I'll pause there because there's a lot of points there, and I hope that gives a flavor of the type of capacity building that's required to take a project to inception and operations.
Thank you, Lynn. And just one very quick extension to that question also is, in terms of capacity building, do you find that when you're working with governments on a particular project, i.e. a very practical learning by doing exercise, that the capacity building is accelerated
Yes.
as opposed to just developing otherwise?
Yes. I think it needs both. Firstly, you need to do the capacity building in a learning sense. And then certainly, that's why when we, as practitioners, we say that the first project in the sector does a lot more than just close a project. It sets, in a way, the benchmarks for the sector, because the government agency, together with the private sector, are engaging in a real contract. So the learning curve is very, very steep in terms of actually, coming to a commercial agreement. To come to a commercial agreement, you have to understand the rationale and the basis, which comes with the initial capacity building as well.
Okay, thank you, Lynn, for that succinct answer. I'd like to now pose another question for Fauzia. Sorry for the pronunciation. And the question, Fauzia, is how.
Paul, are you
lost
there?
Paul.
No, Paul is missing.
I think he's kicked himself off.
Okay.
Hi, sorry about that. There's a connection problem in Bangkok. Must be the rains affecting the region. So just a question for you, if I may. How are public-private partnerships applied in the context of ASEAN countries, and what do they mean for the future of ASEAN?
Thank you, Paul. There's a lot of questions on PPP, and I think the answers could be very similar with what's already explained by our other speakers and in other. But I would like to address this only small part of this question. But before that, allow me to uh, briefly saying something about the urban financing as a general. So if we look at the types of the urban financing or urban projects, infrastructure projects, we could see on the top we have like a commercial projects that can use PPP as a financing modalities because it's a commercial, and then in the dense populated urban that can be the revenue stream enough to recover the cost. And then there in the bottom there's a small urban needs projects that could be financed through the local budget, yeah, through the taxes, user charges, government transfer, etc. But in the middle, there's usually like large and multi-years investment projects that is the main problems. It's a like a missing middle, borrowing from the World Bank terms. Yeah, that the projects require large and long-term finance, while the cities have limited capacity to borrow. So this we can bring it to the PPP, but the challenges are more complex because of that. Those all the things that already mentioned by previous speakers, especially Ms. Lin, that the capacity of the local governments to lead the project, to assess the risk, and to make sure that the project is worth for private sector to jump in. So that's one thing. And second, this PPP could be used in various stages and forms in Southeast Asia. So we usually, if we discuss this, we usually make clusters in Asia, Southeast Asian economies. Let me, yeah, make it simplified, like two tier of PPP development of implementation in Asia. First, that tier one PPP such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand. Singapore is more beyond that. Yeah. So they still need. They already implement some projects, PPP project in various stages, especially in BOT. They have the different challenges, more on that making a pipeline, a good pipeline, and executions, and upgrading their technical aspects, especially on the contract management, risk allocation, and etc. And then they can make use of the innovative financial scheme like LVC, green bonds, and others. And the second one is that the tier two of the PPP maturity stage in ASEAN, such as Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So for them, I think they need to focus more on building good governance and develop a good fundamental for infrastructure finance. So perhaps some missing legal frameworks, uh, some uh, some ability to identify the list of priority projects, and they need also to mobilize and optimize public resources to support infrastructure, because they, even though it's PPP, the public sector needs to provide some resources to do so. And but both in tier one and tier two, these PPP states, both countries need capacity building at at different level of the capacity buildings. Yeah, different targets, different officials, and different knowledge they need to push. Uh,
Okay, Fauzi, that's very good, and thank you very much. We've just run out of time, unfortunately, so but we'll come. We've only got approximately 6 minutes left for this session, but I just want to do two things. And the first one, just to invite Natalia back again, because I know you was cut off. And if you just have a couple of minutes just to finish your presentation would be great. And then I would just like to open one question for our panelists as well. So Natalia, just a couple of minutes, please, to finish off the question.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for the second opportunity. I guess if the person could pull up the deck again. So I think we'll start, yes, from there. Yes, so just to really tie it back to what I was talking about before, the idea of SIF as this initiative to sort of move projects from the ideation to the financing stage, and the portal being that first entry point into the SIF where successful projects are then uploaded, and creating this now pipeline of de-risked and investable projects. So investors benefit from having a more transparent process and able to kind of connect with these projects on the earlier stage and sort of begin this collaborative process of building that investable project together, and creating that common language at the very start. So the beta version is currently live, and it hosts a pool of projects, including ones from Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And we're really hoping to continue expanding this pool of projects. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So what we're opening up now is this open call for urban projects to join the next round of pooling of projects for the city's investment facility and portal. So there are a multitude of opportunities and wonderful things that come with this. For successfully selected projects, there is an access to a pool of investors on a global level, on a local level, as well as access to a new network of cities to learn from. There's project preparation support, so there'll be access to feasibility studies and impact assessments and risk assessment, so everything to sort of plug those gaps in capacity, as well as the opportunity to be showcased to investors and fellow project owners at the World Urban Forum 11, a great global platform to really connect and advertise your project on a global scale. So I'd like to invite the audience to check out the website at www.cetisinvestmentfacility.org. Click the Project Open Call page, download the guiding documents, and review the qualification criteria. And if you have a project with a great idea, SDG in mind, and ready to try and get it to across the finish line towards financing, please do collect the relevant details, fill out the online form, and submit your projects by the 7th of November. If there are any inquiries, do contact UN Habitat-CIP@un.org. So I'm also very mindful of time. And so I'd like to close here and just invite everyone to check out and be part of this growing initiative to close the gap in urban finance.
Okay, thank you, Natalia. And we've only got a few minutes, but I just want to raise up a question, which has been provided by Mr. Chua, Lee Chua. And the question is actually for our panelists, and the question is asking, how can any drainage or sewage infrastructure projects be financed using PPP, and can share any successful initiatives on this? So I'll just like that to open very quickly if any of our panelists have got any really experience and knowledge of any PPPs related to drainage and sewage in the ASEAN region, which they could comment upon within the next minute or so before we have to close the session, unfortunately. Over to the panelists. I mean, I would invite Lynn to answer that, and maybe Difford as well. Over.
Hi, Paul. I guess I'll try and take this one, and if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. I think in terms of just to clarify, drainage or sewage, is that in relation to treatment, so water treatment, sewage treatment projects?
It would appear so, yes.
Yeah. So we've had some water treatment and industrial water treatment, and clearly in Singapore, as an example, they've had a very successful program for water treatment, and there is a good template for that, which has in a way helped Singapore to lower its costs as well as deliver quality water over a long term. Other than that, I mean, there are currently initiatives to look at and help cities improve their sewage supply, and we at P4I in fact working with one Southeast Asian to look at a project in this space. So really starting with the policy and strategy development in terms of how such infrastructure projects should be financed and what sort of funding we should go into it.
We're out of time, Lynn, unfortunately, so I'm very sorry, Difford. And apologies for not getting around to that question. Basically, I'd just like to now just take 1 minute to thank all the panelists and participants to this session. It's been very, very informative. We now understand there's a big financing gap. We understand there's lots of money out there to get invested. And finally, we know that we have to build capacity to get that financial flows into the cities and secondary cities which we serve. And just finally, thank you very much for attending this session. And once this session closes, you're all invited to join the following session, which is a thematic dialogue on urban resilience and developing flood management systems. And that will start in 1 hour at 1:45. With that, thank you, panelists, thank you, contributors, and thank you, audience. And from Bangkok, we wish you a very pleasant evening and a very pleasant weekend.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody.